What if a stranger pulled you from the heart of a burning fire? Would you believe that fate just changed the course of your life? A lumber mill in flames, devoured by the rain-soaked night. A hand reaches out, no name, no questions asked. But that moment was the beginning of everything. What would you do if your past was suddenly forced to face your future? Leave a comment below and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that cuts straight to the soul. Because up next, you'll realize some encounters aren't about saving someone else. They're about finally being saved yourself. Gabriel Vaughn once believed he could be both father and mother to his little girl, Anastasia. But house number 7 on Winlow Hill, after 3 winters without the laughter of the woman he once called home, had slowly turned into a hollow nest. Every morning at 5 a.m., Gabriel would rise, boil water, make coffee, and stare in silence through the fogged-up window, where no one sat across from him anymore. Anastasia was only 7, but her eyes had outgrown her age, like she'd learned to read her father's sadness instead of fairy tales. Every night, she'd sit beside the empty armchair in the living room, whispering stories to her mother as if she were still there. Gabriel never stopped her, never asked, because deep down, he feared the day she'd stop saying "Mom" and forget what love once smelled like, until that rainy night. Father and daughter were sound asleep when the distant wail of sirens echoed from the woods behind their house. A lumber mill, one they'd never seen before, was burning. Gabriel ran toward it on instinct, and through the blaze he pulled out a woman, unconscious, face streaked with soot, arms wrapped tightly around a scorched leather-bound journal, engraved with just 3 words, Anna's table. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment would pull all 3 of them from the wreckage, not to save someone else, but to begin again in a way no one ever expected. Millstone Yard, a long-abandoned lumber mill at the end of Ravendale Road, the kind of place no one in town ever bothered to visit, suddenly erupted in flames on a rainy March night. Gabriel rushed toward it with nothing but a thin coat and a flashlight shaking in his hand. No one ever understood why he was there at that exact moment. Maybe it was the faint cry he'd heard through the rain, or maybe it was something deeper, calling from within. The wooden door collapsed right behind him as he forced his way in. The air was thick with the choking stench of ash and sawdust. And then he saw her, a young woman collapsed against a scorched wall, arms still wrapped protectively around a half-burned journal. Without hesitation, he scooped her up and ran, slipping twice in the mud, crashing down near the edge of the dry creek just behind the mill. Just in time, a deafening explosion tore through the night, shaking the earth where they'd just been. She came to in the flicker of flashlights and the wail of sirens. "My name is Victoria," she whispered, voice hoarse, yet her eyes looked at him like she had known him forever. The only thing she could remember was the phrase etched on the cover of that scorched notebook, Anna's table, where no one gets left behind. Gabriel didn't know it yet, but those few words would open a whole new chapter, not just for her, but for him and for Anastasia. Her name was Victoria Langley. Before being pulled from the heart of a raging fire, Victoria had once been a fixture at every culinary awards ceremony, her hands described as bringing memories back to life through flavor. But then a single photograph was leaked. It showed Victoria walking away, leaving a fellow chef collapsed on the kitchen floor after a gas leak. And just like that, everything crumbled. She disappeared. The world believed Victoria was running away. But no one knew. She had tried to save him. She was just too late. And that was the part that killed her a little more each day. On Winlow Hill, she was no longer a celebrity or a culinary genius. She was just the woman who sat for hours in Gabriel's kitchen, wordless, eyes hollow. Yet somehow, her hands still moved with instinct, chopping vegetables like each slice might bring back some buried piece of herself. Anastasia, 8 years old, was the first to make her smile again. One simple question: "Do you know how to make chicken soup, like my mom used to?" Victoria froze. She didn't answer. She simply stood and began to cook. Steam rose gently in the rain-soaked night. The rich, warm scent filled the small kitchen. Gabriel stood at the doorway watching, and in that moment, he knew. Something had shifted. None of them realized it yet, But that little kitchen, where three broken souls quietly collided, was slowly becoming the first real home they'd known in a very long time. Victoria never said who she really was. She never spoke of the spotlight that once dazzled the culinary world, or the standing ovations she received while accepting awards under glittering lights. At house number 7 on Winlow Hill, she was simply Miss Vic, the woman who woke up early to bake bread and tied her hair with a faded fabric ribbon gifted by Anastasia. Gabriel never asked why she stayed. He saw something far more important. Since Victoria arrived, his daughter had been sleeping through the night. Dinners were no longer quiet affairs with two people silently picking at their vegetables. They were three voices laughing over a bowl of soup someone suspected was missing salt, only to discover Anastasia had accidentally dumped in the sugar instead. But beneath that fragile peace, Victoria always kept her phone face down. Anytime a headline popped up from her old life, she would pause, then delete it. It wasn't being discovered that scared her. It was the thought of being forgiven. One night, Anastasia walked into the kitchen and found Victoria crying softly, folding up an old menu from the restaurant she used to run. The little girl didn't ask anything. She simply reached up and wiped away her tears. "I don't need to know who you were," she said. "I just know your chicken soup tastes better than my mom's." A child's words, but they caught in Victoria's throat. And maybe, for the first time in a very long time, she wanted to stay, not for the past, but because somehow the present had finally learned to smile back at her. Gabriel's kitchen was far from luxurious, just an old wooden table stained with specks of dried paint, a yellowing ceiling light, and a few spice jars leaning awkwardly on the shelf. But to Victoria, that small space awakened something inside her. Something that had been asleep for a very long time. The first breakfast was nothing special. Slightly burnt eggs and bread that didn't rise quite right. Yet for the first time in years, she felt what it was like to have a meal that wasn't judged. There was laughter. There were reminders to wash hands. And a quiet thank you from little Anastasia for sharing the last spoonful of strawberry jam. At first, Victoria kept her distance, but slowly she began revisiting the dishes that once defined her, not for magazine photos or reviews, but for the pure joy of seeing a child's eyes light up and say, "Miss Vic, this cake feels like a cloud pillow." Gabriel watched from the doorway, holding a mug of cold coffee. He said nothing, but in his eyes something had shifted. It wasn't about the taste. It was that Victoria had started breathing in rhythm with this home. One night she quietly scribbled into her old notebook, "I used to think the kitchen was where I burned to ashes, but maybe it's also where I'm being lit anew." No one needed to see those words, because the fact that she dared to write them was already the beginning of something. Anastasia didn't ask many questions. She simply sat there, legs dangling from the armchair, eyes fixed on the fairy tale book Victoria had left half read. At first they read the classics, stories everyone knew, but one night Victoria didn't open the book. Instead, in a whisper-soft voice, she began, "Once upon a time, there was a girl who burned down the kitchen she loved most, all because she was afraid people would think her food wasn't perfect enough." Anastasia stayed quiet, wide-eyed. And just when Victoria thought the little girl had fallen asleep, a small voice broke the silence. "But did anyone ever cook her a meal?" A simple question, but it caught in Victoria's throat. From that night on, Anastasia would ask to hear more. "Tell me again about the strange chef girl." And over time, the story stopped being just a fairy tale. It became a kind of healing for both of them. One evening, Gabriel stood quietly outside the door, listening. Victoria's voice drifted through the wood. And she realized the most precious thing wasn't a perfect dish. It was who was sitting at the table with her. Anastasia giggled. "Then I guess I'm the reason she stayed a little longer, right?" Victoria turned away, hiding the red in her eyes. She had never imagined anyone would call her the one who stayed. But somehow, that tiny heart had already made space for her. Not just at the table, but in a family she never dared to dream of. That afternoon, as the last slant of sunlight spilled across the moss-covered roof tiles, Gabriel stopped in front of an old building on the corner of Eldermore Street. Dust coated the glass door, and a broken sign hung crookedly above it. D. Ning Hearth. No one had set foot inside in nearly 10 years. Victoria looked over his shoulder and asked softly, "Why this place?" Gabriel paused, then said, "Because if a place was once a hearth, maybe it can be lit again." The next day they began cleaning. No fancy tools, just bare hands, buckets of water, and a promise left unspoken. Victoria, with worn-out gloves, quietly wiped down each shattered glass. Gabriel sighed as he dismantled rusted lights one by one. They didn't talk about the past, but both of them knew they were healing it, piece by piece. On the third day, Anastasia showed up, holding a crumpled piece of paper covered in messy crayon scribbles. "Name for the place, the Hearth of Anna, because it feels warm, like I do." Victoria laughed, but tears still fell. It was the first time she'd seen her name on something that felt like it truly belonged to her. No one said it out loud, but from that moment on, they weren't just two people passing through each other's lives anymore. They were rebuilding a home from the fragments with trust and the scent of the very first slice of buttered toast. On opening day, a light drizzle fell softly over the shop's awning. No grand banner, no bright red ribbon, just a simple wooden sign, handmade and modestly hung by the door. Anna's Table. The name stirred curiosity, but only 3 people knew its origin. A crumpled sketch drawn by a little girl who once didn't dare call anyone mom. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of toasted bread, pumpkin soup, and a trace of cinnamon. The old wooden tables had been polished to a soft glow, each one set with a handwritten note. "There's always a place for you here. No reservation needed. Just bring your heart if it's still searching for a place to rest." The first to walk in wasn't a regular. She was an elderly woman, quiet and alone. She sat by the window, cleaned her glasses with a handkerchief, and whispered, "The last time I had a meal with my husband was right here, back in 1997. Gabriel looked at Victoria. They both smiled. No words were needed, but amid the warmth of that moment, the door swung open again. A stranger stepped inside, holding an old newspaper in his hand. His gaze swept the room and then locked on Victoria. "I know you," he said. "You're Victoria Langley, the chef who disappeared after the scandal in Elmsworth." A spoon clattered to the floor. Gabriel froze, and Anastasia just stared at her mother, waiting for the truth. His name was Nathaniel Sterling. He lived quietly on the northern slope of Bramble Hollow, a place no one really visited anymore, not since his wife passed away. Once the most skilled woodworker in town, Nathaniel had turned down every project since the day he lost her. And yet, for reasons no one quite understood, he nodded when Gabriel asked for help rebuilding the cafe. Maybe it had something to do with the tiny sweet pastry Anastasia gave him, wrapped with a crayon drawing and a note. "Can you rebuild this place like my dad rebuilt my heart?" He didn't reply, but the next morning he showed up with a hammer, a chisel, and a sack full of nails. Each day, the sound of saws, nails, and Victoria's laughter wove through the air like a melody. Nathaniel worked in silence, yet every beam, every carved handrail, bore the touch of quiet precision. Each piece a small act of care. One afternoon, Victoria stepped closer, resting her hand on the fresh-cut table he just finished. "Why did you decide to help us?" she asked. Nathaniel looked up, eyes reflecting the soft gold of the fading sun. "Because I see in you someone trying to find herself again, with her own hands, just like I once did." It wasn't just encouragement. It was a quiet reminder that rebirth sometimes begins with those who've already faded into the background. But just as everything seemed to be coming back to life, an old photograph slipped from Nathaniel's notebook, and in that faded image lay a truth no one had seen coming, a hidden connection between him and Victoria's family. The spark that would ignite the next turning point in their story. When the wooden sign reading "Anna's Table" was finally hung above the door, no one expected something so small to ripple through all of Bramble Hollow. And the first person to walk in wasn't a stranger. It was Genevieve Clark, owner of Clark's Corner Store. She was known for her sharp tongue and for never ever complimenting food. But that day she sat by the window, ordered the pot roast sandwich, and cried. Not because of the flavor, but because of memory. "This recipe," she whispered, "tastes exactly like the one my husband used to make. I thought it was gone forever. Less than a week later, the second visitor came, Scarlett Monroe, an elderly woman who lived alone on the edge of town, once dubbed the white-haired ghost, because no one really knew her story. That day, she didn't say much, just walked in with a basket of red apples, placed it gently in the kitchen, and nodded at Victoria. "I don't cook," she said, "but these apples, they'd be good in one of your pies." From two women no one expected, something began to bloom. The cafe became more than a place to eat. It became a space where people quietly left behind fragments of their past, memories once too fragile to share. A worn recipe, a childhood flavor, a small offering of love that had waited far too long. There were no loud declarations, no slogans on the walls. But everyone understood. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was where memories were reborn, where lonely hearts were given a seat and a chance to belong. But amidst all the warmth, an anonymous letter arrived. No return address, just a single sentence scrawled across the page. "I know who you are." And for the first time since that night in the fire, Victoria began to tremble. On a foggy morning, when mist blanketed the worn footpath behind the cafe, Anastasia heard a faint whimper coming from the brush behind the kitchen. She left her half-eaten bowl of cereal on the table and ran outside, then froze in place. A German shepherd, rail-thin and scraped raw, lay trembling beneath the bushes. But its eyes, bright, piercing, looked up at her as if to say, "I've come a long way, just to find this place." Gabriel suggested taking the dog to the rescue shelter, but Victoria stood still, silent, because in those eyes she saw the very same look she once carried the night of the fire at Millstone Yard. Abandoned, and yet somehow still hoping. Anastasia named him Kaiser, the little king of broken hearts. And true to the name, in just a few days, Kaiser not only healed, he became something extraordinary. Every customer who walked into Anna's table eventually found themselves kneeling to pet him, smiling, or simply sitting beside him as if they'd known him forever. Kaiser laid himself across the front steps. No leash, no command. And whenever someone walked in carrying a heavy heart, he would gently nudge his head into their palm, just enough to let them know that here even sadness had a seat at the table. From an abandoned stray, Kaiser became the living emblem of Anna's table. As Gabriel once said, he's not just a mascot. He's proof that even what the world throws away can become a miracle, if we're patient enough to let it in. And no one yet knew that Kaiser, this quiet king, would be the very key to unlocking the secret Victoria had tried so long to bury. Anna's table didn't open with red ribbons or marching bands. It opened on a sunlit Saturday morning, soft and unassuming, like the breath that follows a long, restful sleep. The scent of buttered toast, the quiet clatter of pans, and the warm swirl of cinnamon from Victoria's signature rolls drifted through the air, mingling with the soft chime of wind bells above the door every time someone stepped inside. The first to arrive was an old man who had walked from the bus stop, just hoping for a glass of warm water. But he stayed all morning, simply watching Anastasia make cocoa for a little boy he didn't know. Then came a young couple, road-tripping across states. They stopped only because they saw Kaiser. The German shepherd curled up by the steps, eyes half closed in peace. Later, a group of traveling merchants wandered in, thinking it was just another small-town diner. They left with tear-streaked cheeks after reading the small note tucked inside their receipt. "You deserve to be loved, no reason required." No one left the cafe empty-handed. Some carried a look, some a story, some just the feeling of being seen. Soon the name Anna's Table rippled through Meadow Springs like a sweet whispered secret, passed from one person to another. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was where people paused, healed, and sometimes found their way back to themselves. And while no one noticed, amid all the smiles and soft laughter, Victoria was slowly rebuilding the woman she thought she'd lost. And in the warmth of the kitchen flame, Gabriel realized he hadn't felt alone in a long, long time. There was something about Anna's Table, something unspoken, that made those who had drifted from the world start finding their way back. An elderly woman picked up a pen for the first time in 10 years after Victoria handed her a blank sheet of paper and gently said, Write down what you remember most about your mother's kitchen. A young drifter came in asking for dishwashing work, but stayed because Anastasia handed him half a warm sandwich without a single question asked. And a couple on the verge of divorce returned for a second visit because both of them, separately, had found themselves missing Gabriel's mushroom stew from that day. There was no magic here, only wooden tables scrubbed by hand, paintings on the wall, each one a gift from someone who had once walked through their own cracks, and in every glance exchanged, a quiet kind of understanding. People began calling it the Healing Cafe. No one made announcements. They came because their broken hearts needed a place that reminded them how it felt to be alive. Some left behind handwritten notes, tacked gently to a corner of the wall. Today I cried, but I wasn't ashamed anymore. Victoria read those notes at night after the kitchen lights had dimmed. Gabriel didn't say much, but every morning he started unlocking the door 10 minutes earlier than the day before. And Anastasia, she placed one extra cup on the shelf each morning, just in case someone shows up who's never been invited to sit before. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with a miracle, but with a seat that was saved just for you. That morning, Victoria opened the mailbox and found a sealed envelope, crisp and carefully folded. Embossed in silver on fine white paper was the logo of LaSalle, the restaurant that had once been her dream and her downfall. Inside was an invitation, a formal offer to return as head chef for the brand's expanding international chain. The salary alone could have bought the entire town of Meadow Springs, but what stopped Victoria cold was the final line of the letter. You were the soul of our kitchen. Come back and reignite the fire. She didn't reply, not right away. That whole day she moved through Anna's table in silence, cooking, cleaning, smiling at guests. But inside a storm was raging, between fame and peace, between what she once dreamed of and what had only just started to feel like enough. Later that afternoon, Anastasia wandered behind the cafe and found Victoria sitting alone, the letter still clutched in her hands. She didn't ask any questions. She just leaned close and whispered, "If you leave, I'll tell stories to Kaiser every night, but I think he'll miss you a lot." Gabriel didn't say a word, but that evening, he quietly placed a new jar of homemade strawberry jam on the kitchen shelf with a handwritten note. No matter where you are, something sweet still needs someone to taste it. That night, Victoria lay awake, not because she feared losing the opportunity, but because for the first time, she realized there was a place that saw her presence as enough. And that was the one thing her heart feared losing most. At dawn, as sunlight brushed gold across the trees on Pine Grove Hill, Victoria quietly dragged her old suitcase across the wooden porch. The same planks that had memorized the rhythm of her footsteps each morning. No tears, no goodbyes. She left her apron on the kitchen hook and a folded note beside it. Thank you for letting me be myself, if only for a moment. No one knew she was leaving. Anastasia was still sound asleep, arms wrapped tightly around Rosie, the stuffed bear Victoria had stitched back together just the night before. Gabriel was in the kitchen prepping a new pumpkin loaf for the weekend menu, and Kaiser, who seemed to be dozing near the door, suddenly jolted up at the sound of it closing behind her. He barked once, not to stop her, but as if to ask, "Are you sure?" Victoria walked faster. She made it as far as the bend near Larchwood Station, where the town still lay wrapped in morning mist. Then she stopped. In her bag, her hand brushed against something, a drawing, Anastasia's, from a rainy afternoon. 3 people sitting around a table. Beneath the shaky, scribbled words, "My family," her chest tightened, not from fear, but because, for the first time, she understood what it meant to lose something you never let yourself admit mattered. A bus rolled into view, headlights slicing through the fog. Her escape, her return to everything she once thought she wanted. But her heart, for the first time in years, wasn't sure it was heading the right way. And then, she turned around. No explanation. Just the quiet knowing that if she didn't, she would regret it for the rest of her life. The bus wheels let out a soft hiss against the damp pavement. Victoria stood still in the center of Maple Hill Gate Station, her hand trembling as she held the ticket. She had made her decision. She was leaving, Again. But this time, her heart wasn't numb. It ached, deep, sharp, with every beat. Then, a small voice cut through the morning fog. "Wait for me." Victoria turned, and her heart nearly stopped. Anastasia was running toward her, barefoot, her coat slipping off one shoulder, flapping wildly with every frantic step. Behind her, Gabriel was struggling to keep up, breath ragged, holding something high in the air. A flash of pale cloth blurred in the mist. A handkerchief, cream-colored, trimmed in soft lavender, each delicate stitch whispering the words that had never been spoken. Victoria dropped to her knees, reaching out. In the corner of the fabric, in a slanted, fragile script, "You belong where love waits." She swallowed hard. It wasn't a plea to stay. It was a door, left open. Gabriel said nothing. He simply held out his hand. No demands, no expectations, only a look that said, "If you still believe, maybe we can start again." Anastasia clung tighter to her hand. "Don't go," she whispered. "We haven't even made the cream cheese bagels you love the most." Victoria smiled, and one drop fell. No one could tell. Was it the rain or a tear? But the ticket slipped from her hand, caught by the breeze. It tumbled across the platform, landing softly at her feet, like a quiet farewell to a life she no longer belonged to. Victoria stood frozen for a few seconds, as if time itself had paused. The handkerchief in her grasp grew warm, but it was their eyes. The quiet depth in Gabriel's, the pleading innocence in Anastasia's, that cracked open the walls she had spent years building. Gabriel said nothing. He simply placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Not begging, not pulling, but offering. A quiet invitation, tender, honest, free of pressure, and Anastasia, still holding her hand tightly, as if afraid that with just one blink, Victoria might vanish like a dream at dawn. Victoria's chest tightened. It had been so long since she'd felt needed. Not for her name, not for her reputation, but simply for being there. She used to think she only existed in the grand kitchens, where people shouted her name like a brand. But here, at a quiet little bus stop, in a sleepy little town, she had found something else. Herself. Not flawless, just real. And then she broke. Not with the bitter sobs of regret, but with the trembling, liberating tears that come when winter ice finally gives way to spring. She pulled them both into her arms, holding them as tightly as her heart could manage. And for the first time, she didn't run. She didn't calculate. She didn't flinch. For the first time, she chose to stay. Not because someone expected her to, but because her heart truly, deeply wanted to. For love, for family, for a beginning that asked for no spotlight, only sincerity. The official opening of Anna's table didn't happen at the cafe. It happened at the Larchfield Community Library. An unusual choice, but one filled with meaning, because in a place built to preserve memories and knowledge, they had chosen to begin a new chapter, not just for themselves, but for a small town that had long forgotten how to believe in kindness. Victoria stood in the center of the room, her eyes moving across familiar faces. Genevieve Clark, with her quiet smile. Scarlett Monroe, carrying an apple pie she'd made by hand. And Nathaniel Sterling, standing in the back as always, hands still dusted with sawdust. Beside her, Gabriel was adjusting the collar of Anastasia's dress, a simple white one embroidered with the name of the cafe, each letter drawn by Victoria's own hand. In the corner, Lillian Windsor sat quietly, jotting notes in her weather journal. An independent journalist once known for documenting forgotten places, she hadn't come for a story. She came because this one had already touched her. A woman who thought she had no way back. A man who didn't know how to say "I love you." And a little girl who chose to believe in the good. Lillian didn't take many photos. She just wrote with her whole heart. Because sometimes a story of healing doesn't need a grand stage. It only needs to be told in the right place, to the right people, at the right time. And that day, they all chose to stay, not to start over, but to keep living, more fully than ever before. Behind the cafe, where overgrown weeds once tangled across forgotten soil, a vibrant garden now bloomed, known simply as the Rosebrush Garden. It followed no formal design, no neat rows, no manicured edges, just wild bursts of color, growing freely, like the hearts that had tended it. Victoria started with a few heirloom rose cuttings from an old market. She wasn't a gardener, but every time her hands sank into the earth, she felt something quiet settle inside her. She planted out of memory, and also to forget. Each morning, Anastasia woke up earlier than usual, hugging a tiny watering can as she darted between flower beds, asking the same question again and again. Do you think there will be a new bud today? The question never changed. And maybe that was the point. A child's way of believing that something good could always begin tomorrow. Gabriel never said much. But one afternoon, as Victoria was pulling weeds, he quietly placed a wooden bench beneath a canopy of blossoms. Carved into the seat were three simple words: "Home grows here." It wasn't a declaration, it was a promise. A corner of a garden, a single bench, three people, and a story that once felt finished now continuing, one small moment at a time. Because sometimes a home isn't built from bricks and beams, but from memories, from faith, and from love, watered gently every morning. That afternoon, as sunlight poured gently over the rosebrush garden, a middle-aged man stepped into the cafe, his coat worn thin at the shoulders, his hands trembling as he held a small piece of paper. He didn't speak. He simply offered an old photograph, a young woman with eyes that shimmered just like Anastasia's. Victoria looked at the photo, then at Gabriel. Her chest tightened. The man was the father of a girl who had gone missing after the war. Once a kitchen assistant in a bustling city restaurant, vanished without a trace. He had searched everywhere. No one ever gave him hope, until he heard whispers about Anna's table. That day he didn't ask for anything. He sat quietly at the last table by the window, ordered a slice of apple pie, and wept in silence. Victoria poured him a cup of warm tea. No questions, no comforting words. Gabriel placed a steady hand on his shoulder, the way one does for an old friend. And Anastasia, without saying a word, offered him a handkerchief, gently wiping away the first adult tear she'd ever seen that didn't need to be hidden. From that day forward, Anna's table became something more. Not just a cafe, but a place people came to when there was nowhere left to believe they were still worthy of love. A place where the lost came to find themselves. Not through reason, but through kindness and quiet, unshaken patience. And if you've ever been that person, you'll understand why some doors don't need locks to feel safe. Only a reason to come home. What do you think of Anna's table? If there's a place like this in your life, share your story in the comments below. And if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, hit subscribe so these stories can keep finding the people who need them most. The most precious things in life aren't fame, wealth, or the spotlight we once chased. They're a warm meal, a real embrace, and the look in someone's eyes that says, "You matter." The story of Victoria, Gabriel, and little Anastasia isn't a fairy tale. It began in fire, in loss, in hearts broken in more ways than one. But from the ashes, they built a home, not with bricks and stone, but with quiet acts of kindness, with every choice to stay, even when no one asked them to. Anna's table doesn't heal the world, but it stitches together the cracks in the people who walk through its doors. The words carved into the garden bench, "Home grows here," aren't just a phrase, they're a reminder. Family doesn't have to share blood. It begins the moment we choose to accept someone with their past and all the pieces they're still learning to carry. Life can be cruel, but there's always a small door, one that opens through compassion, a place where someone who was once lost can become the very anchor someone else needs. And maybe the greatest lesson of all is this: never underestimate the power of a simple meal, a quiet embrace, or a person willing to sit beside you when you think no one else ever will.